I'm a what?
The Brits. Ain't they great? But long before Harry Potter or the Beatles, the British people just might have brought to the world one of its biggest chaotic and longest-going conflicts. I don't even need to name it. But first, let's take a deep dive back to explore this claim. 1914. The war to end all wars. This is going to sound irrelevant, but slowly it'll all make sense. For over 500 years now, it was the Ottoman Empire ruling the land known as Palestine. You wouldn't be calling the land in those years peaceful, as you'd call it empty. Majority of Arabs and a small minority of Jews. Not even 700,000 people in the whole land. But if there's one thing this land was always known for, is getting caught up in others' wars. Napoleon, Caesar, Alexander the Great. They've all been there. Wouldn't you want to go down in the history books as one of the greats? And so soon as World War I started, far from the European trenches, two of the biggest empires in the world turned the entirety of the Middle East into a one big desert battlefield. And even if hard to believe, the Brits were actually struggling keeping both of the lines together. Almost losing Egypt to the Ottomans, the gate to Palestine looked unbreakable. Only then, an interesting proposition was brought up. With the rise of the Zionist movement, an underground organization named Nili offered to help the Brits with spying and attacks from within the land itself in exchange for a promise that someday the Jewish people will have a place of their own in the land of Palestine. The Balfour Declaration, published November 2, 1917, is still considered one of the key moments in the history of the Zionist movement, being the first time the historical Jewish right for the land was recognized. Only, the Brits were not relying on only one plan. They knew losing meant a great loss for the empire, and were doing everything they can to prevent it. At the exact same time of the declaration for the help of the Jews, also the Sharif Hussein bin Ali received some big promises from the Brits. Hussein, being the king of Hejaz, one of the holiest land pieces for the Muslims, had a vision. He wanted to bring back the great Syrian Empire, ruling all the way from Mecca to Al-Aqsa. At this point of the war, the Brits were being able to promise anything to anyone if they thought that it will help them. Both of which did, by the way. With the thought that as soon as the war will be over, the land will be his, Hussein led an Arab revolt against the Ottomans that caused them to split their forces, just at the right time for the Brits to break the gate with the help of the information the Jews gave them. By the end of 1917, British forces, under General Edmund Allenby, entered Jerusalem, and the Ottoman Empire's grip on the land began to collapse. By 1918, it was over. World War I had ended. The Ottomans were gone, and the land of Palestine was now in British hands. But I'm sure they'll keep their promises now to both, won't they?
I have brought peace, freedom, justice, and security to my new empire.
Your new empire?
Well, they took control. That's surprising for the biggest colonizing empire in the world, huh? To the Jewish leadership, they had promised a national home. To the Arab leadership, independence. In reality, they gave neither. And this is where things start to change. Because under British rule, everything accelerated. Jewish immigration increased, especially as Jews fled growing persecution in Europe. Arab communities began to fear losing land, power, and their future. Tensions weren't just rising, they were boiling. With both the Arabs and the Jews feeling persecuted by the Brits, the anger was rising. By the end of the 1920s, a couple of violent events coming from the threatened Arabs towards the Jews led them to establish the militant organizations that later on became the IDF. But 1936 is where it all changes. A long time of feeling discriminated against turned into what started out as just protests. But the violence of the Brits against those protests turned them soon enough into riots. Soon enough, it turned into something else.
لازم نكمل ايد واحدة عشان نحمي بلادنا ووحدتنا هي اللي حتنهي امبريالية بريطانيا وفرنسا على أراضينا. نحن
An armed revolt, guerrilla fighters in the hills hiding in caves, attacks on British forces, clashes with Jewish communities. For the first time, this wasn't just tension, it was almost a war. The Brits didn't respond nicely. It took some time, but being brutally crushed, the Arabs didn't really stood a chance. By 1939, the Arab Revolt in Palestine had been officially suppressed, not with compromise, but with overwhelming force. More than 5,000 Arabs were killed. Hundreds of Jews lost their lives and dozens of British soldiers died in the process. But beyond the numbers, this revolt became one of the most important moments in the history of the Palestinian people. Because while the revolt failed militarily, it was a moment that for the first time defined the Palestinian nationality as something worth fighting for. Yet we can find in this revolt the same problem that appeared a decade later in the 1948 war, being their divisions and internal conflicts. One aspect the revolt did succeed in was when, in an attempt to stabilize the land, through the White Paper, the Brits started limiting Jewish immigration and publicly tried once again to structure a new map for an independent Arab land that was rejected. This step only made the Jews frustrated and caused them to start and operate against the Brits as well. It doesn't look like it's really going anywhere good. By the time World War II had ended, Britain found itself exhausted, with attacks frequently killing British soldiers by both Arab and Jewish organizations looking for independence. And so, in 1947, rather than resolving the conflict they had pretty much shaped, the British chose to step away from it, handing the issue over to the United Nations, effectively leaving others to deal with the consequences. In 1948, they withdrew completely. No final agreement had been reached, no shared solution had been built, and no real peace had been established. Only two sides, more determined and far more divided than they had ever been before. The British didn't create the conflict out of nothing, but through a series of decisions, promises, and contradictions, they helped turn a fragile situation into a lasting one, a conflict that would continue long after they were gone.